My name's Kevin Appleby. I'm the Senior Fellow for Policy and Communications for CMS, and good morning. Welcome to our symposium. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. And all I did was vote. But it's a beautiful day outside, and the sun does come up. There was about a 48-hour news blackout in my house after the election. It wasn't because of the results. It was just I didn't want to hear about politics for a while. I don't know about you out there, but all the commercials and the conversation and the debate. But I'm ready. We're here to renew ourselves and get back to advocacy form, if you will. So I'm going to be your MC today, for lack of a better word. And the title of the symposium is Looking Forward, Challenges and Opportunities in Migration, with an emphasis on challenges. One of my favorite movies, The Sound of Music, has a line that captures our moment today. When God closes a window, he opens a trap door. No, that's my cynical version. What the real line is when God closes a door, he opens a window. So today we're going to try to open a few windows. That will be the goal today. But actually, our speakers today will discuss both the challenges and opportunities on the international, national, and state and local levels. We have experts to talk about how immigration and refugee advocates can sort of recapture the immigration narrative in the country. And we also have a panel of experts that will help us map the path forward. So we have a lot to do today, and we have a lot of good information for you. So, Jaden, if you could thumbs up. Great, okay. Our first speaker will help us give us a bird's eye view of migration globally and how the global community hopes to tackle the challenge of global displacement. We are honored to welcome the Honorable Bob Rae, the Government of Canada's permanent representative to the United Nations. He also is the president of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, better known as ECOSOC, which is a central forum for discussing international economic and social issues and in formulating policy recommendations addressed to member states and the United Nations system. Ambassador Rae has chosen safe migration as a focus of ECOSOC's deliberations this year. The ambassador has a long history in the field of migration. He was appointed special envoy to Myanmar by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, where he engaged in diplomatic efforts to address the crisis with the Rohingya and the Rakhine state, and was named by the Prime Minister to be Canada's special envoy on humanitarian and refugee issues in 2020. Mr. Ambassador, welcome. Can you hear us?
I can hear you very clearly. Can you hear me?
Yes. Welcome to the symposium. Thank you for being here. And after your remarks, we're going to have a few questions for you. So just don't run away after you're done, okay?
I've made it a lifetime habit not to run away from anything. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'll say a few words and I'll be glad to join you. Well, thank you so much. And I heard the opening speaker, and I just want to put a couple of things in perspective because I think it's important to look at this. If you look at the issue of the movement of populations, truly historically, I mean, going back to the origins of human species, we need to understand that movement of people and the movement of people across continents and around the world is really a very critically important part of the human story. The narrative that says this place has always been my home and is mine and doesn't belong to anyone else and no one else can come in is a narrative that repeats and repeats and repeats, not only over the history of any one country, but indeed over lifetimes and generations. But we need to understand that the movement of people speaks to a couple of central facts. The first one is the changing nature of climate and the changing nature of technology and the issues of demography and population growth, conflicts, wars, ethnic tensions, all of the things that have given rise to large movements of population in the last couple of 100 years have been a constant in human history and are a constant with us today. And they're playing a very critical role as to exactly where are we today. So looking at the situation globally, not just in terms of the United States or Canada or any one particular country, we can see a couple of things very clearly. The first is that this notion of displacement and dispossession, how people can lose their homes, can lose where they are, is deeply affected by climate change. It's deeply affected by conflict. It's deeply affected by technology, by changing economic opportunities. And above all, I think we need to understand that the movement of people is also affected not just by objective factors, by external factors, but it's dramatically affected by internal factors. That is to say, factors that are internal to the human personality. When people are faced with an oppressive situation, they don't just sit there, they move. When people can see that they have no particular opportunity where they are because of caste and class and race, they may feel that they're stuck and they want to get out of where they are. So that very powerful human aspiration is a driving factor for migration, always has been, and always will be. So I think one of the things that we in Canada have been trying to do in the course of our work on a number of issues is try to reestablish the normality of migration. That it's not some strange beast, even the use of the word alien, that it's not an alien experience. It's an experience that's part of the human condition. And therefore, the question becomes for governments, not should we allow migration or not, and I would argue, but it's how do we allow for migration? What methods can we use to deal with the current phenomenon, and how can we deal with it not only at the national level, the local level, at the state level, but also understand the need that it is a global phenomenon. It's not just affecting one country. It's not just affecting one government or one people. And right now, we're seeing an unprecedented level of conflict in the world. We are undergoing, despite the denials, we are undergoing significant climate change, which is making parts of the world more difficult to live in, not to say uninhabitable, changing agricultural patterns, forcing people to leave and to migrate and to move around. In that, the numbers tell the story. We have about 140 million right now, people who are effectively displaced, but that understates the issue dramatically because it doesn't deal with people who are in extremely precarious situations or situations which we know will blow up and become full-fledged crises. And this is true of every continent. It's true in Asia, it's true in Africa, it's true in Latin America, it's true in Europe, and it's true in the Americas generally. So we need to understand this as a global phenomenon. It's not just a national phenomenon. And I hesitate to say this as a Canadian, but we notice that a lot of the American conversation is as if this is an issue that is only affecting the United States, and it's not. It's affecting everybody. So how we respond to it is, I think, critically important. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that the United Nations is made up of nation states for whom national policies are the most important. It may sound strange for a diplomat to say this, but I did spend most of my career in politics in Canada. And so you become very aware that all politics is local, and yes, it's provincial and it's national. And states take this issue of sovereignty very seriously, and they take very seriously their right to decide who can come and who must leave and who can come. And that is foundational, not just to one country, but it's foundational to every state. So we must not, I think, make the mistake of thinking that international attempts and efforts to regularize and normalize the fact of migration are intended to say to nation states, you no longer have the power or the ability to decide who's going to come and who's going to go. But it is a way of reminding nation states that how they do what they do has a critical impact on everybody, and that what happens in one country can have a dramatic effect on your neighbor. Another important fact to realize is that internal displacement is the first fact that takes place. And we now have an unprecedentedly high number of people who are internally displaced in countries all around the world. People who are no longer able to live where they're living and have to go somewhere else in their own country. The second group of people are the people who leave the country, who migrate. And again, I think it's important to emphasize as a fact, because there's so much mythology, rumor, and lies, that it's important to remember what the facts are. The facts are that most people who migrate next door, literally to the country next door to them, or very nearby, which means that most of the displaced people who are being pushed out of or moving out of countries in Africa are moving to other countries in Africa. And many times the lie that's stated is everybody's coming to one place. Everybody only wants to go to one place. And that's why we have to get rid of anybody who's there illegally. And that's why we have to stop anybody who wants to come here. And the final factor is it's really important to bear in mind something called economics. People move. The movement of people is an economic phenomenon as well as a human and an ethical phenomenon in terms of people needing to move and the treatment of refugees and so on. So it's exceptionally important to remember that the economy, people usually move because they can't get work where they are and because they think they can find work where they go. And in many cases, they can find work where they go. And the number of people who have found work who are without documentation and who are, quote, therefore, quote, illegal, not a term that I use, we speak of undocumented people, people who do not have the documents that they need in order to be able to regularize their trip. So these are all the factors that are at play globally. And in this context, there are many forces at work that are making it very difficult for us to have a reasoned discussion about migration. When I say reasoned, I mean there are times and places and circumstances where countries can say, look, we can't take everybody in. We can't take in the number of people who want to come. We have to restrict that number. My own country right now is going through that exercise, although the numbers that we're taking in are still compared in a documented legal way are still very large per capita compared to virtually every other country in the world. But Canada, nevertheless, is introducing policies that are more restrictive and limiting than they have been before. We ought to be able to have a reasoned discussion about that because nobody's saying we're going to go from 500,000 to zero. People are saying, well, we're going to go to 500,000 to probably around 400,000. And everybody starts saying, oh, well, now you're just embracing the rhetoric of restriction. No, we're looking at the economics of it. We're looking at the practicalities of it. We're looking at housing and other social amenities that are necessary. And we're trying to figure out how do we manage continuing to take in a very large number of people, which is what Canada has been doing for a long time. I guess the last thing that I wanted just to say, I know there'll be lots of questions, is the other thing that makes this difficult to have a reasoned conversation, and first speaker mentioned this, and I think it's really important to state it, and that is that rhetoric about the other, rhetoric about the alien, rhetoric about outsiders versus insiders is really takes us down the slippery slope because it's based so much on rhetoric around race, caste, class that can create very hateful narratives. And frankly, narratives that are also contrary not only to human rights and to the motive to love other people, but also very much contrary to what is in the economic interest of everyone, which is that those very economies that are saying we don't want people actually need people. And this is one of the great contradictions that we face. So just to end on a slightly more positive note, there are some interesting developments that are happening in the migration process within regions. One of them is there are some countries recently, Thailand, Colombia, a number of other countries in the world, Turkey in their own way, who have taken in large numbers of people very quickly and who've made a point of saying, we want you to live, we don't want you to live in camps. We want you to become as integrated and as quickly as you can, because we know that putting people in camps is a terrible thing, and camps have a way of lasting forever and forever. And when that happens, it creates all sorts of other sets of problems, which we're dealing with all the time around the world. And there's a much greater discussion going on now within a number of countries about how do we deal with this movement of people, both internal and coming in from outside? How do we deal with it rationally? How do we try to focus attention on how quickly we can integrate people and make life bearable for people as opposed to making life unbearable? And how can we turn what is described in a great many places as a negative, how can we turn that into a positive? And I hope this year in ECOSOC we'll be having some discussions to deal both with internal displacement and with the arrival of refugees and the arrival of undocumented migrants, to really try to change the conversation so people will understand. The second thing that's happening, and it's not altogether, it can have its difficulties, but it is nevertheless happening, is that where it appears that large numbers of people are going to arrive, countries will often say to other countries, and international institutions will say to other countries, if you keep these people, we will help you cope with that. In other words, we will pay you. And whether it's an individual country that will pay or whether it's an international institution that will pay, and that's not a bad thing at all, that's a good thing. And the final thing I just wanted to say is that one of the areas in which Canada has really had remarkable success in order to try to break down some of the internal barriers to accepting people more quickly is to allow communities and individuals and families to sponsor other people to come to the country. So we started doing private sponsorships in 1979. It's a process that started with the Vietnamese boat people in Canada, where there was a really quite remarkable community mobilization to take people in and to do it in a way that said, yes, we'll sponsor you, we'll pay for this, we'll pay for that, and the government will pay for this and pay for that, and we'll do this, we'll do it on a regular basis. We've now taken in close to 400,000 people since 1979, which I think is pretty remarkable. And we now have 20 countries around the world, including the United States, who've started adopting this policy. Not that they would give Canada credit for that, but that's okay. Every country likes to think, oh, we invented this great idea. And we say, well, yeah, we've been doing it for a while. But the notion of the private sponsorship of refugees, of course, is not new. It actually has a long history. Even during the worst events in Nazi Germany in the 1920s and 30s, there were many, many refugees who came out because they were sponsored by people, because people said, we'll take them. And any resistance from the government, they just said, don't worry, we'll make sure it's done. But what this private sponsorship does, I think, is place migration deeply within communities, which is really where it belongs when you think about it. Because the only way we build up public support for migration is getting people to understand that the people who they say they don't like are the people who are actually their neighbors. Their kids go to your schools. You who actually know these people. That little boy plays on the soccer team with your son, and so I think that the more we can embed the normalcy of migration, the normalcy of movement, and the normalcy of how this has always happened and how it needs to keep on happening, I think the stronger we will be in our ability to turn against those who say that migration is a bad thing and has to be stopped. I think we need to understand that it is public opinion that drives a lot of things, but public opinion also moves and changes. It comes and goes in waves. Sometimes public opinion is driven by total irrationality, negative stereotypes, the pictures in people's heads which bear no relationship to reality. And so I think how we communicate with each other about migration and how we talk about it is exceptionally important. And that, I think, is something at the international level we've tried to do with the Global Compact on Migration, Global Compact on Refugees. But sometimes this is 50,000 feet. The most important thing we can do is really try to strengthen the ties between communities and the ties between people. And that, I think, allows us to have a much more sensible conversation based on facts, not on myths, based on realities, not on fears. And I think that has to be a central objective for us as we go forward. Thank you very much for allowing me to join you. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We are going to have a few questions. We're going to have a mic out in the audience, so if you just want to raise your hand to ask a question. But while we're waiting, I'm going to ask you a quick one, if you don't mind. You touched upon ECOSOC in your deliberations. You wisely put safe migration as one of your priorities for ECOSOC. Are there any outcomes that you envision from your deliberations, and will those mature into policy recommendations for member states? What was your thinking when you included safe migration in part of your deliberations? Because in the past, it hasn't been there for the ECOSOC, and it was sort of smart of you to put those in. So could you give us more of a sense of what policy outcomes you foresee from the deliberations?
I don't think the policy outcomes will be what I would call immediate. I do think what we're trying to do, for example, on internal displacement, the UN's had an internal process on internal displacement. The UN's had a process led by Robert Piper, who's done a terrific job on working with countries to change their thinking and change the narrative inside a number of countries about the movement of people within the country. And these are huge movements, millions of people. And as this work his work is coming to a head and conclusion with some policy recommendations, what I wanted to do was to give him and give that group an opportunity to allow countries to tell their stories and just to show us how it's done. I think it will have an impact on policy. Whether it will have an immediate impact on resolutions, I don't know. I think we need to have a real conversation too about, for example, in the Americas, we have this dramatic movement of people, not just from one country, not just one or two countries, but many, many countries, including other countries, for this route that goes up through Darien, up through the Americas to through Mexico to North America. And I think I mean, I had an opportunity to go there to Darien last year for a couple of days and stand and watch and see the people coming through and talk to them, interview them, and talk to them about where they were coming from. Whether they were coming from China, they were coming from Azerbaijan, they were coming young women coming from Venezuela and from Colombia, different places. Many young children, and it's really that just struck me then that it was really important that people understand how this is the world that we're living in, and we need to figure out a way to ensure that people survive and are safe and don't get killed on the route. And that's why I think the notion of safety is so important. And frankly, increasing the level of obligation of countries to take people in and to make sure people are treated properly and not treated like really badly, and in fact, left to human traffickers and prostitution and drugs and crime and gangs. And there's a large criminal element now that's involved in the movement and trafficking of people that is generating billions of dollars, and we need to understand it better. That we don't do we don't have a right to have binding resolutions, but we do have a right to contribute to the policy world and to the discussion about the policy. And whether my successor at ECOSOC, I only last for a year. I'm sort of like have a lifespan of slightly less than a butterfly, but while I'm there, I'd like to have a little impact on a couple of things. So that's one of the reasons I chose this area.
Terrific. Any questions from the floor? I have one more follow-up question. I hate to hog the microphone, but in choosing safe migration, how does that fit into the Sustainable Development Goals? I know there's an element in the Sustainable Development Goals for migration, but it seems like it has not been as prominent of an issue in that process than it should be. What's your vision of how the migration fits into achieving those Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, our attitude to migration, I think, in public policy is sort of like the Victorian attitude to sex, and that is, if you don't talk about it, maybe it won't happen. But the reality is, it happens. So it is happening, and it's a very, very prevalent policy issue now, and it will be even more so in the times ahead, precisely because of the factors that I've listed. So although it's not something that countries necessarily like to talk about because they're worried about domestic opinion, we really have to work harder on getting migration studies and just really talking about what migration is and what it isn't, and how it needs to be discussed in sensible ways at the heart of what we do. It's really not. I mean, it's interesting, but it's also troubling that when somebody said no one's talked about migration at ECOSOC before, I said, well, that's ridiculous. Why wouldn't we? And why wouldn't we have it as part of an ongoing effort to deal with it as a reality? And maybe that's something that will start to happen as we go forward. If countries will begin to understand that it's at least something that has to be discussed. It's politically difficult because many countries take the view anything to do with migration is our business, it's not your business. But what we need to understand, and I say this very respectfully to our American friends, is what you do has a huge impact on the rest of the world. And what any country does has a huge impact on the rest of the world. If you decide that you're going to kick out millions of people, where are they going to go? And what's that going to mean? What's that going to do? You can't just externalize all these problems. And that's true for every country. That's true for everybody. So I really do think that that's reason why we need to study this issue, but also why we need to understand, as there's a book by this title called The Wealth of Refugees. I mean, none of our countries would be what we are without migration. I wouldn't be where I am without migration. Everybody has come from somewhere. even if it was part of the great indigenous migrations of tens of thousands of years ago. Everybody has moved from somewhere else. So we all need to understand that.
Well, great. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being with us today and for your time. And we look forward to working with you in the future.
I do too. I look forward to hearing more about your work, and thank you all, everybody. It's good to be with you this morning. Thank you.